All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and we've reached Chapter 18 of 19 in Murachs HTML5 and CSS3. We're going over the PowerPoints in conjunction with the AWD Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class. Chapter 18, we'll learn how to design web pages for a website, and more than anything else, they just give you a boatload of guidelines. All right. Chapter 19 will talk about, in a very general way, how to deploy a website from a local computer or a server to a web server that has internet access. Okay. I'm not going to actually do the deployment in Chapter 19, but we will eventually do that, I promise. So, let's get started. Looks like we have, wow, 1 applied and 14 knowledge objectives. So let's go through those first. Our 1 applied objective: design a website using the guidelines, methods, and procedures of this chapter. Our 14 knowledge objectives: describe the notion of usability and explain how the current website conventions contribute to usability. Describe 2 basic approaches that you use to design the pages for responsive web design. Describe the primary principle for homepage design if you're designing a small site for a relatively unknown company. Describe 3 ways to let users of a website know where they are. Describe the use of chunking. Describe or list 3 guidelines for typography on a web page. List 3 guidelines for web writing. Describe the life cycle of a website. Describe the most important principle for making a website easier to maintain. List the 4 steps in a general procedure for designing a website. Describe the use of a sitemap for designing a website. Describe the use of wireframes for designing web pages. Distinguish between a web designer and a graphics designer. And finally, describe the concepts that top-down design and prototyping are based upon. Well, again, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a lot in here and have a lot of guidelines in here. All right, a website that is easy to use. What website users want. Define what they're looking for as quickly and easily as possible. There's something in website design that's known as the 3-click rule that says in an ideal world, no matter where you are on a website, you'll be able to get where you want to go within 3 mouse clicks. Doesn't always happen though. Second, we want to be able to get information or do the task that we want to do as quickly and easily as possible. And I would even add the word as intuitively as possible. It should be very obvious if somebody wants to do something, that they're able to do it. How website users use a web page, well, this always varies, but most scan the page to find what they're looking for. They don't like to scroll. If they can't find it, most people will just leave, and oftentimes they'll never come back. They often click on links and buttons with the hope of finding what they're looking for. All right, and use the back button as necessary. Some guidelines for improving usability. The first one they talked about earlier in the book was this critical information above the fold. And again, this goes back to the days of an old-fashioned newspaper that was folded in half. And the most important information was on the top half. Group related items into separate components, but yet limit the number of components on each page. Adhere to current conversions for website usability. A web page that illustrates some of the current website conventions. Well, usability refers to how easy it is to use a website. It's crucial when you're working on a web page. Now, if we look at this, we've got some conventions. The header convention. The header consists of a logo, a tagline, utilities, and a navigation bar. So this up here, including this, that's the header area right there. The tagline identifies what's unique about the website. If you call it that or what. The navigation bar provides links that divide the site into sections. The utilities consist of links to useful but not primary information. If the site requires a search function, it should be in the header. It should be a large text box with a go or a search or something after it. So you can see it follows most of those conventions. The navigation conventions, underline text is always a link. Here we don't have any underlines. Images that are close to short text phrases are clickable. A small symbol in front of a text phrase is clickable. Short text phrases and columns are clickable. If you click on a cart symbol, you go to the shopping cart. If you click on the logo, you go back to the home page, regardless of where you are. If the website implements these conventions, users should be able to use the same techniques on your site that they use for other sites. Again, you want to fit in. You don't want to stand out in that aspect. Here's the full screen view of the San Joaquin Valley Town Hall page. There's the mobile view. 2 ways to provide for mobile devices we talked about in previous chapters. Number 1 is to use a responsive web design, which we discussed in Chapter 8. And number 2 is to build a separate website for mobile devices, which we just went over in the last chapter. 2 ways to design pages for responsive web design. You can either design the mobile pages first and then expand, the mobile first principle, or you can design for computer browsers first and make sure the designs work with pages when they're displayed on mobile sites. Now, by today's standards, the best way is to use responsive web design, but it's not always practical for large sites. Sometimes, in that case, it makes more sense to actually have a small, separate site. This figure will talk about, they present this and we will talk about 9 guidelines for developing an effective homepage. Now, there actually is a book by Jakob Nielsen and Marie Taher that's called Homepage Usability, which presents 113 guidelines for home pages, plus an analysis of the home pages for 50 different websites. The book is a bit dated, but the author says, at least in his humble opinion, it's still a good read. So here's the guidelines. Number 1, emphasize what your site offers that's valuable and how your site differs from the competitors. Number 2, emphasize high priority tasks so users have a clear idea what they can do. Number 3, don't welcome users to your site because it's a waste of space. Number 4, group items in the navigation areas so similar items are next to each other. Number 5, use only icons for navigation if the users will readily recognize them, or only do that if they're readily recognized. Number 6, design the homepage so it's different from the other pages of the site. Number 7, don't include an active link to the homepage on the homepage because it's redundant. Number 8, plus it'll cause the page to reload. Number 8, code the title for the homepage as the organization name followed by a short description, and limit the title to 8 or fewer words with 64 or fewer characters. Finally, number 9, if the site provides shopping, include a link to the shopping cart on the homepage. Always let users know where they are. There's 3 primary ways to do this. First, you should highlight the links that led the user to the current page. All right. Second, the heading for the page should be the same as the link that led to it. And third is by using what are referred to as breadcrumbs. As your site gets more complex, the users are likely to lose track of where they are on the site, but sometimes even simple sites, you can have a problem, especially if they're not laid out well. All right. Making the best use of web page space. Many people, when they talk about a website, will talk about real estate, and that's the amount of what's on your page that people can see. You've got a limited amount of real estate, so you'd like to make sure that you use it in the best way possible. Some guidelines for this: keep the header relatively small, prioritize the components for each page, give the most important components the primary location. Remember that the most valuable space is that space above the fold. All right. This page here is entitled A Home Page That Has Been Chunked. Chunking refers to dividing content into smaller chunks that can be presented on separate pages or in separate components on the same page. It makes the information more accessible to the user, and you probably won't have the need to scroll. Two JavaScript features that you can use for chunking, shown back in Chapter 16, are accordions and tabs. Now here is a home page right here that does not apply or adhere to the principles of graphic design. All right. Those principles are alignment, where related items on a page should line up with one another. These don't necessarily all line up with one another. Proximity, where related items are close together. Repetition, where you repeat some elements from page to page for continuity. And contrast, to draw your eye to the components on the page. If everything is the same, then of course nothing would stand out. Typographical guidelines shown on the slide here and on page 517 in the text. Limit the line space to 65 characters. Use the sans serif font. Show the relationship between the heading and the text that follows by keeping them close. Use dark text on a light background. Don't use an image for the background. Don't center text. Don't justify text. Keep it left justified. When they say don't justify, I think they mean fully justify. If you indent the first lines of a paragraph, you don't need space between the paragraphs. Don't use reverse type, white type on a colored background for text. If you're not a graphics designer, you can at least apply these principles to make your site look more professional. Now, writing for the web is on 618 and 619, and the author says right here, and rightfully so, use fewer words. Write in an inverted pyramid style with the most important information first. Use headings and subheadings to identify portions of text. Use bulleted lists and number lists to make information more accessible. Use tables only for tabular information. Don't use all caps for headings. Make the text for all links as explicit as possible. Keep the line length 65 characters or less. So, web users typically skim a web page and scan what they're looking for. They don't read it like you read a book. So when you write for the web, you have to be able to follow the guidelines we just mentioned. So notice the difference between this, which is not written for the web, and this, which is much easier to read and scan through. Okay? All right, here's the life cycle of a website. You design, you implement, you maintain, and notice you go back to design again because it's an iterative process, but it goes back and to the end then. So to make a website easier to maintain, you use HTML for content only and CSS for page layout and formatting only, and JavaScript for interactivity only. Don't use tables for page layout. Don't use frames, which we haven't even talked about. Get the design right before you do the implementation. Define the audience and set the goals for the website. Develop a sitemap. Sketch or wireframe the critical pages in black and white. Illustrate the critical pages in color. Develop the HTML and CSS for the pages. Develop the pages. Deploy the site to the server, which is the next chapter, and test and launch the site, which is also in the next chapter. Plan the changes, design the changes, implement the changes, test and launch the changes. This life cycle that was shown starting here, again, it includes design, implementation, and maintenance. Oftentimes, more time is spent in maintaining the site than was spent in developing it in the first place. As you design a site, you'll need to have agreement from people as far as, when you can go on to the next step, etc. So they go through this using their Joaquin Town Hall site. All right, this is so they define the audience. And before you can define the audience and the goals of a website, you need to get the information that's necessary to do that. Typically, your target audience will consist of more than one type of visitor. So there's their target audience. Second, they develop a sitemap. And again, with a sitemap, it can be, this, believe it or not, is fairly simplistic, but nothing at all like this. All right. Again, the site that we will create will be very simplistic. I'm just telling you, warning you, or whatever you want to say. So to document the navigation for a website, you develop a sitemap that shows all of the pages that the website requires. In the sitemap, the second level represents the links in the navigation bar, and the contents below it represent the pages that are accessed by those links. You can develop a sitemap using a simple drawing program like Visio, or you can use a commercial product, which typically may at least cost you quite a bit of money. Next, you go in and you wireframe. When you wireframe, all right, it's a sketch or a drawing done in black and white, so the focus is on the components of the page, not how the page looks. A wireframe can be done by hand. There are also free and commercial products that you can use for wireframes. After the sitemap has been approved, you wireframe the home page and one or more of the primary content pages. When those are approved, you can go on to the other critical pages. In general, you don't wireframe every page in a website if the website is fairly complex. Fourth, you illustrate the critical pages. So after the wireframes are approved, you illustrate the critical pages typically in full color like we see right here. To do that, most graphic designers use a product like Photoshop. Another alternative is to actually develop the pages using HTML and CSS using something like Dreamweaver. Okay. A couple of other design considerations here. All right. First of all, let's talk about the difference. These are typical members of a development team. Notice you've got web designers in there, writers, marketing specialists, and graphic designers. The web designers participate in all phases of the design process, including typically the coding phase. Graphic designers focus on the graphics. In fact, many people who are graphic designers have little to no development background, may not know much programming or any programming whatsoever. In a large company, a website is usually designed and developed, or implemented rather, by a team. In a small company, one person may do everything. So a web designer is typically confused with graphics designer, but graphics is just a part of web design. All right, the last thing that's discussed in here is top-down design and prototyping. When you've got top-down design, what it means is you start with the most difficult aspects of the website and proceed your way down to the less critical aspects. This implies that you don't have to complete the sitemap before you wireframe and illustrate all of your critical pages. The second method to be aware of is prototyping. When you prototype, a prototype is a limited working model, so it typically doesn't have all of the bells and whistles in it. This gives reviewers an accurate view of what the pages will look like. The major benefit here is that you can detect problems early in the development lifecycle when it would cost less money to fix it. In general, you start by prototyping the critical pages of the site you've identified via top-down design. And that's it for this chapter. So, in just a couple minutes, we'll go on to the last chapter, which is on how to deploy a website on a web server. I'll be back with that very shortly.